Hello, it is I, the B in the Y. Happy Easter, apparently. But more importantly, happy 1st of April. Every year on this date, I take a little so-called break from the Bionicle YGOPro expansion to instead invest a bit more effort than would otherwise be reasonable in something slightly different. Usually, this results in a special release. But this year, making an actual implementation of what I felt like doing would have required an amount of effort more unreasonable than what the date can justify. So instead, you're getting a PowerPoint presentation.
PowerPoint!
And we begin with today's main topic, titled Virtues, a Bionicle CCG. The background on this one is the imaginary scenario where Konami, in its infinite wisdom, somehow kills the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Before my YGOPro expansion is done covering all of Bionicle. How could the project continue in such a case? One option is I could just keep going, but working on a static corpse of a game is likely to get boring after a while. Or I could switch to a different game, but that would feel like a bit of a downgrade to me. Or I could make my own game with blackjack and hookers. And precisely that brings us to Virtues, a CCG made from and for the legend of the Bionicle. A quick disclaimer at this point, this is not a functioning game design. It is unfinished, untested and probably unplayable. It's more a collection of ideas that could eventually be used by future me or someone else entirely, who actually wants to figure this out for real. Any numbers you see in this presentation are going to be especially made up and don't make too much sense if you think about them for more than 2 seconds. With that said, what's a CCG anyway? The acronym stands for Collectible Card Game, which is a type of game that goes back to 1993's Magic the Gathering. Since then, the concept has inspired a wide variety of titles that add their own twists to it, but broadly speaking they all can be described as follows. Players construct a deck from a large pool of cards with different properties and abilities. They face each other in a game where those cards interact with each other and with the players. The winner is the first player to reach a predefined goal, often involving some kind of life resource that has to be reduced to 0. So let's talk about our game starting from the cards. These are, as is often the case, divided into a few different card types. To figure out what those should be, the question I asked myself was, what building blocks does the story we're trying to tell need? And the answer I came to was that most stories, including those in Bionicle, can be generalized to the form someone uses something somewhere to do stuff. For example, Takua uses the Toa stones at Kininui to call the Toa. From that, we can derive 4 different types of cards. Beings, which represent the characters in the story. They have a white frame and are played onto the field to actively engage in battles. Items, which represent inanimate objects in the story. They have a grey frame and also hang out on the field, but don't actively battle. Locations, which represent the setting of the story. They have a green frame and are played into a dedicated zone from where they influence the game. And actions, which represent things that happen in the story. They are played onto the field only briefly and leave after applying their effects. So in Yu-Gi-Oh! Terms, we're basically looking at the division into monsters, continuous spell traps, field spells, and normal spell traps. Now there are some properties that are universal to all of these card types. The obvious ones are the name, the image and the card text. But also in the top right corner of the card you have a coast. We're not quite ready yet to look at the coast system I designed for this game, so for now just remember that this icon with the number 1 in it can be read as a duty coast of 1. Then there's also an element, which can be fire, water, wind, earth, light or dark, but also stone, ice and all other manner of nonsense. As we can see here, it can even be blank in some cases. And finally, Next to the element there is a list of groups, which can also include subgroups, like how the Toa Mata are a subgroup of Toa. As for properties that only matter to some card types, there are the stats that are used for combat. Beings, which can both declare attacks and be the target of attacks, have both attack and defense listed. Items, which can only be an attack target but not actively attack, have only defense. And it's important to note here that the names resemble Yu-Gi-Oh, but the battle system does not. When a battle occurs, the attacking player chooses an attack target, and the two combatants deal damage equal to their attack to each other's defense. This makes defense act like a health bar per card, which is just a fun feature to have from a designer's perspective. Obviously this is quite similar to what Magic did originally, but even more closely it matches the system found in Shadow Wars. There are of course many more aspects to consider when it comes to battle. Do we need summoning sickness? Is there a dedicated battle phase? How does life point damage work? All of those, I would say, are best figured out in testing, of which I did none. So yeah, moving on. A property unique to locations is the location level, and this is a bit of a weird one. The best way to explain the reasoning behind it is to take a look at the Matanui field spell I made for Yu-Gi-Oh! It has one effect that searches the field spells of places on the island, as if zooming in, and another that brings it back if that searched field is removed, as if zooming out. This is a trick to deal with the common pattern in Bionicle, where locations will exist within other lore-relevant locations, and so I wanted to have it implemented on the level of game mechanics instead of card effects. Which is where the location level comes in. Locations with a higher level than the one currently active are stacked on top of it. Only the topmost layer of the stack applies its effect at the time, but if the active location is ever removed, you automatically fall back to the one you had previously, zooming in and out. And in the case where the location on top of the stack has a higher level than the one you're trying to play, you'll just have to remove layers from the stack until you find a lower level one, or until none are left. Circling back to card text again, because yes, it is found in every type of card, but it's also kinda the most important part of the game. The format I would like to use here is one of structured text that does include some keywords but no icons. Basically, the goal is to maintain the very useful property of reading the card explains the card, while still doing what we can to simplify said reading. To add structure, we use numbered effects and a leading clause for stuff like once per turn restrictions, just like what the Yu-Gi-Oh! OCG does. The individual effect should also include elements that clearly communicate the effect type and where it applies, as well as some highlighting of costs and conditions. Putting it all together, a Yu-Gi-Oh! Effect of if you control no monsters, you can discard one card, special summon this card from your hand or graveyard, might become, in brackets, active hand grave. In parentheses, if you control no beings. Discard one, arrow. Place this card in your destiny area. Leaving aside terminology for now, what this achieves is that you just need to glance over the bracketed parts at the start to know which effects could actually be relevant in the current game state. So much for the cards, and now we get to the field on which they are played. Virtues gives each player a field that looks like this. It has a duty deck, which is where you draw your cards from. It has a unity deck, which works a little like an extra deck. The destiny area is the main battlefield where you play your cards. The duty area plays a role in the coast system, and the unity area is relevant for the unity deck. The location is the special zone where you stack location cards, the grave is where spent cards go, and the seal is our counterpart to the banishment. Allow me to explain each of those in a bit more detail. The destiny area is where battles happen and where most effects are used. In the story you carve out as you play, the cards placed here are the heroes fighting to fulfill their destiny. To play a being, item or action into the destiny area, you must pay its duty cost. We call this assembling the card. Beings and items remain in the destiny area until removed in some way, while actions leave immediately after applying the effects. The duty area simply holds the cards that are used to pay duty costs, and this is the point where I can finally explain the cost system. First, you place cards from your hand into the duty area in upright, on-duty position. When you pay a duty cost of a certain amount, you do so by turning that many cards in your duty area to idle position. At the start of your next turn, all the idle cards return to being on duty. Now once again, this is a really central aspect of balancing on which I haven't gone deep enough to decide all the details, but I imagine there might need to be some tweaks to the timing of the transition between idle and on duty, as well as a limitation on how many cards can be placed in the duty area each turn, even though I personally quite like the idea of having as much cost available as you're willing to expend card advantage. The final of the virtues, Unity, appears twice on the field. Firstly on the Unity deck, which is functionally an extra deck, but meant specifically for combinations of multiple cards. To a Kaita, the Golden Kanohi, or even just an action that represents a combination attack. As you can see, Unity cards can belong to different card types, and where they would normally have the duty cost, there is instead a Unity symbol. This means that instead of paying duty, you assemble these cards using the materials listed in the section of the text box that also has that symbol. When you do so, the materials go from the destiny area to the Unity area in idle position. When the Unity card leaves the destiny area by any means, those materials in the Unity area immediately turn ready. And finally, at the start of your next turn, all ready cards in the Unity area return to the destiny area as if the combination has come apart. This gives us built-in floating effects and lets Unity actions, which leave the field right after being used, operate by basically blinking out the material until the next turn. Then there's the location, which is a zone separate from the destiny area specifically for, well, locations. We've talked about how this works already. It's a stack of cards where the topmost location is active, higher location levels go on top, and for lower ones you remove layers until it becomes higher. Finally, we have Grave and Seal. The former is just where cards naturally go after they're used up or removed. Many games like to have a fancy name for it, so maybe we should too. Archives, Chronicle and Wall of History come to mind, but they don't really convince me. Anyway, the seal is a place that exists only so we can have effects make cards even more gone. Flavor-wise, this is meant for non-lethal seals that may be temporary, like freezing a being in ice or something like a tower seal. One more mechanic to cover are destiny cards, meant to represent evolutions of a single entity rather than combinations of multiple. Their special trait is that they can be played in either the deck or the Unity deck, and you can assemble them from the hand by paying the listed cost and duty, or from the Unity deck by sending the listed material to the grave. You can imagine this as telling a story featuring the evolved form versus telling a story of the evolution itself. Kind of like the difference between the Toanuva in Mask of Light and in the Borok saga. We also have a concept of equipping, indicated on certain items by having one of the groups marked with the chainlink symbol. An item in the destiny area that has a group marked this way can equip to a being in the destiny area as that group. Equipped items are attached under the being, much like Xyz materials, and apply their effects labeled with the equip location. However, you can only have one item equipped as the same group at a time, and if that isn't the case, you have to send one of the conflicting items to the grave. The purpose of this is really just to not let you equip more than one Kanohi at once. For turn structure, I've come to the conclusion that we need a draw phase, A ready phase where all the movement in the unity and duty area happens at the start of the turn, a main phase where you do all the stuff, and an end phase where effects expire. Maybe also a battle phase, but again, that's a question for someone who actually did testing. And as the final point, we do need to think about how effects are ordered and how responses work, because there are trigger effects and quick effects in this thing. Here I've decided to copy Yu-Gi-Oh! And have multiple effects form a chain that resolves in reverse activation order. The main alternative would have been the stack from Magic, which lets you add activations between resolutions and respond to things beyond the most recent effect, but chains not allowing these things is exactly what makes resolving them so fun and allows for chain blocking, so I find them superior. On the other hand, when it comes to ordering simultaneous trigger effects, it's probably better not to copy Yu-Gi-Oh! And its pedantic distinction of mandatory and optional effects. Just let each player choose the order of their effects, turn player first. Done. If you want some more information on the game, check out this link, which you can also find in the description. And before we proceed to part 2, have a look at some cards that I already tried converting from the YGOPro expansion to word use. And here's part 2. This one is going to be a bit shorter because the game is in an even less developed state, but in principle is just as complex, if not more. This time we're looking at a whole board game titled Rahi Overlord. While I was making a big spreadsheet to plan out all the different Rahi for the YGOPro expansion, I started wondering if this analysis I was doing couldn't also be used in another way. For example, for a board game in which players take the role of Makuta engaging in a so-called Rahi-off, a contest where they aim to have Rahi of their creation become dominant in a certain area. This is, of course, canon, just like the term Californication. As before, and now even more, I must start with the disclaimer that this game is unfinished, untested, and probably unplayable. On top of that, it's probably way too complicated for its own good. And any numbers you may see here are still total bullshit. Alright. What's the board like in this board game? Well, it's made up of multiple zones, each of which has some distinct properties. One of those is a biome. that specifies which Rahi like to live in it. All kinds of biomes are possible: forests, rivers, the deep sea and so on, but they always belong to one of the three categories: land, sea or mixed. Each zone also has a capacity or a number of slots that hold Rahi and are also used to track the populations. And finally, the middle of the zone contains something called a point of interest. They start the game face down, get flipped up the first time a player takes control of the zone, and from then on apply some kind of effect. What does take control mean here? Simply that the player who has the most Rahi in a zone is set to control that zone. The resources players have available to them are exactly those that are required to create Rahi: liquid protodermis and viruses. The protodermis is basically just water and therefore readily available, so we're only subtly representing it as a limit on the number of Rahi you can create in a round. Viruses, on the other hand, have a physical representation as orbs or cubes or whatever hedrons in different colors, which you gather over the course of the game and spend to make Rahi. Each species of Rahi requires a different combination of virus colors. That information, among many others, can be found on the Rahi card that serves as a blueprint. Right below the name you have the recipe of required virus colors, in the Tarakawa's case a blue, a red and a yellow virus. Further down we find a habitat, which is the Rahi's preferred biome. The color of the background indicates whether it's land, sea or mixed, and restrictions apply on what zone the Rahi can be placed in. Fish can't go on land, basically. However, you do not need to exactly match the name of the biome. Doing that just gives an optional bonus. Next, we have a diet, which provides a baseline for calculating population growth. Herbivores mostly grow at a fixed rate, carnivores grow by consuming the population of other nearby Rahi, and omnivores can do both of those things, but if they only do one, it's going to be suboptimal. The size is mainly for complicated dynamics of predator and prey that I haven't really figured out myself, but I expect there needs to be something that keeps tiny critters from eating giant beasts. Finally, there is a list of traits, which is just an assortment of special keywords that each have their own effects. When you have a Rahi card, you can use viruses according to the listed recipe to create an individual population of the Rahi. This is represented by a playing piece you construct by taking a little stand in your player's color and adding a cardboard token representing the Rahi species. The assembled playing piece is then placed into an open slot on the target zone at the lowest population level. The other cards that exist in the game are Makuta, or the player characters. These also list some information that impacts gameplay. The affinities make it easier for the Makuta's player to create Rahi with certain habitats, diets, sizes and/or traits by letting them substitute one virus on the recipe for one of any other color. The ability is a unique effect that can be used at some point of the game as per its text, and the Makuta Lab is a special point of interest that each player places at the start of the game, and it gives a fixed bonus to only that player in the zone that holds it. When setting up the game, each player first picks a Makuta card and places the matching lab face up in a zone of their choice. Face down points of interest are randomly distributed across the remaining zones. You shuffle the Rahi cards and form a deck and give each player a starting stock of viruses. Something like one of each color, I guess. You are now ready to play. The main gameplay loop is structured in rounds of 5 phases, and in almost every one of those phases, players also take turns. For example, the research phase at the start of the round works like this. The turn player looks at the top 3 cards of the Rahi deck, takes one of them, returns one to the top of the deck and the last one to the bottom. This repeats with the next player in turn order until everyone has taken a card. You can then proceed to the creation phase, where the turn player has the option to spend viruses according to the recipe of one of the Rahi cards to create that Rahi and place it in a zone where they have either the lab or an existing Rahi population. This repeats in turn order until no one can or wants to create further Rahi. Next comes the calculation phase, and now it gets complicated. Because what you have to do here is figure out the population change for every Rahi in every zone based on the current populations, biomes and habitats, diets, traits, and so on. Some kind of helper sheet would probably be useful to keep track of all this, but I fear no matter how we do it, it's going to end up super complicated. Maybe this is just going to be a game that appeals exclusively to ecologists and mathematicians. Once you've made it through the calculation phase, you enter the migration phase, where the turn player is allowed to split a sufficiently large population and move part of it to an adjacent zone. Or they can take an entire population, regardless of size, and fully move it to an adjacent zone. But this should only be once per round and player, or you'll end up with Rahi zipping all over the map. The process repeats in turn order until all players have completed their movements. Finally, in the extraction phase, players gain fresh viruses based on the board state. Maybe the colors follow the biomes of the controlled zones, or properties of the Rahi, or just random. No idea at this point. In any case, once that is done, you have finished the round and begin the next round from the research phase. How does this game end? Great question, I don't really know. Most likely you just quit after a certain number of rounds or when some condition is met, and at that point the player who controls the greatest number of zones is declared the winner of the Rahi off. The Rahi Overlord, if you will. And that's it. One more link to check out for further information, also to be found in the description. Thank you for listening all the way through, and as we now return to business as usual, all that remains to be said is goodbye. Also like and subscribe, I guess.